Pam Bondi said that the Epstein client list was on her desk to review for release to the public just a few months ago.
You said last week that you have the Epstein files on your desk. When can we see them, and what's taking so long to release them?
I do. Jesse, there are well over, this will make you sick, 200 victims. 200. So we have well over 250 actually. So we have to make sure that their identity is protected and their personal information. But other than that, I think tomorrow, the personal information of victims. Other than that, I think tomorrow, Jesse, breaking news right now, you're going to see some Epstein information being released by my office.
What kind? Are we going to see who was on the flights? Are we going to see any evidence from what he recorded? Because he had all of his homes wired with recording devices.
Yeah, what you're going to see, hopefully tomorrow, is a lot of flight logs, a lot of names, a lot of information, but it's pretty sick what that man did.
Okay, well, we'll
along
look for
with his
that.
co-defendant.
Absolutely, and he had help. That's for
He
sure.
sure did.
But now that she's in charge of the Department of Justice, she claims that there's no Epstein client list at all. And this all comes a month after Kash Patel and Dan Bongino, who really made their careers as MAGA influencers off of this Epstein story, determined that Epstein killed himself, that no one else was involved with his trafficking ring. He was apparently trafficking young girls to nobody at all. And the response given by Trump officials and even Trump himself to a public that's angry and which wants further disclosures is for everyone to stop. The FBI says that it doesn't want to, quote, re-traumatize the victims, and so nothing else will become public, even though it's the victims like Marie Farmer who've been leading the effort to get the full truth behind the Epstein case. Aaron, what were your initial reactions to those statements from the Trump administration this week?
Well, I have to say that very little shocks me these days, and I certainly wasn't that shocked or surprised by it. It was always this irreconcilable thing that was with the Trump administration because he ran his backers and his his base, a lot of the podcasters and other people that are out there flacking for him, they were kind of on the right-wing conspiracy side of things. And so there's a whole lot of conspiratorial statecraft that the US deploys all the time. And Epstein would be an example of that, sexual blackmail. And so they were, these right-wing conspiracy people have a better understanding than the leftists who don't believe in any sort of, Epstein-style conspiracies as being, part of the way that the government operates, right? It's a strange thing that in some areas or some issues, right-wing, paranoid conspiracist people would be have more on the ball than left people because they're in denial about what the US regime is, what capitalism is, what the empire is. So this it was an odd thing because in the case of Epstein, yes, it involves like pedo trafficking and grooming and in different ways. You could talk about the ways that it would involve all these sort of hot button things for right-wing Americans. So it became a sort of cause that they were kind of preoccupied with, right? But we all know that Trump gets all this money from Israel lobby people, the super Zionists like Adelson, and it was pretty clear that Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were they represented in his Mossad assets working with the CIA. If you understand the structure of the clandestine state and how it's evolved, which is a pretty obscure thing, and I have a particular sort of theory and narrative to explain that, but it's interesting that there's not a lot of people on the left who are academics who are interested in this material, which is, I think, unfortunate because the criminality of this regime and the way that it operates with these organized crime, as a partner of the U.S. regime is a very important part of this system. And if you don't understand it, you're missing a big part of the story. And it really does, the more you understand it, the more it delegitimizes this system. So it's not surprising that Trump would realize, like, I can't expose this because to expose it would expose Israel at a time when public support for it is already, plummeting. And it's just better to, basically betray all of my supporters and lie, and break all these promises I made rather than do something that would be really damaging to Israel and to the U.S. national security state.
So it's hard to think of anyone who was closer to Jeffrey Epstein than Donald Trump. Maybe Bill Clinton, who routinely flew on his planes and he's been photographed getting massages from one of Epstein's accusers. But Donald Trump was incredibly close to Epstein. This idea that Trump was going to be the person to reveal the truth about Epstein and expose the cover up was always silly, in my opinion. And you agree. If you believe that, you were scammed. But there's a large group within MAGA that sincerely believed that Trump would investigate Epstein further and reveal the truth to the public, and they now feel betrayed. Just remember how central Epstein was to the MAGA campaign, and it's easy to understand why. So there's a real expectation for Trump to follow through and release more information, and that didn't happen, to prosecute the other abusers in the Epstein network. And now that Trump has joined the cover up, it's really broken their brains. I'm not sure if you've seen any of these videos, like of Alex Jones crying and even puking in his car.
So now, by coming in and being part of the cover up, the Trump administration has become part of it. I mean, it's just, you cannot see it any other way. So I just got to the office. So I'm going to go throw up, actually. And this only happens every few years when something really, really bad happens or something. I mean, I'm physically going to puke probably right now. My mouth is watering right now. It's because I have integrity. And, I just really need the Trump administration to succeed and to save this country. And they're doing so much good.
What do you make of that meltdown within MAGA, though?
I don't know if I have to admit I didn't want to watch it because the thought of it just made me uncomfortable, seeing like people like, oh no, this is Alex Jones crying and watch, he's gonna puke. I thought, okay, I think I'll accept the summary. It's pretty funny and I'll remember it, but I'm not gonna watch it. But I don't know how sincere, I can't gauge how sincere Alex Jones is. I mean, there's a lot of like ridiculous showmanship. He seems pretty clearly to be in the mold of like a right-wing conspiracist person. So I've kind of thought he was a plant in some ways who was being boosted to kind of delegitimize looking into state criminality, sort of institutionalized state criminality, because he will mix in some sort of facts about disturbing things like Epstein, right? And he'll sometimes interview good people, but then he goes back and, kind of discredits himself with his, whole perspective on things. And in the general worldview of like, well, it's these globalists, it's the globalists, it's this other group of people, or some people just be like, it's the Jews, right? This is like right-wing conspiracism that it doesn't put the emphasis on the system itself that produces this oligarchy that's pretty much incompatible with democracy. And so you have to have some criminality to make sure that the laws and democracy don't like get in the way of the oligarchs being able to just decide how everything is going to be. So somebody like Alex Jones and these other right-wing people, they don't understand that this was overdetermined, that this is how it would happen, because this is the regime that we live in, and the people that really run things know that they can't run it the way that they must run it according to the people that really pay all the bills, and they can't do that without criminality of every kind. I mean, you have to be able to assassinate people, you have to be able to blackmail powerful people, you have to make sure that politicians don't get ideas about how they're going to be good guys in this or that way if it upsets the people with a lot of money and power. And so that's they're disappointed, but it's not surprising that they'd be disappointed in this, because they don't understand how it works. They don't understand the function of right-wing conspiracism. They don't have a critique of capitalism or imperialism that makes a lot of sense, in my opinion. And so they're disappointed. They do recognize the criminality of the system and the status quo, so I give them credit for that. But they don't and they do depose the forever wars. I mean, it's interesting that there's kind of an awakening among some people on the right, even though they'll go and say things that are foolish, or they'll just miss obvious things that they should understand. There is more of an awakening that, man, this country has gone to hell and it's corrupt and criminal. So that fundamental fact is interesting. They just don't get that it's like imperialism and capitalism, which are kind of inextricable, is cannot but have this sort of criminality. Whether, excuse me, whether it's killing all the Indians or enslaving people, exploiting third world countries, colonialism and all of that, it's always been that way.
I do want to ask you about that because there is this kind of disbelief, even on the sort of liberal part of the left, kind of more in the center, that the United States could even do this. I was talking to Daryl Cooper last week about the Iraq War, and the idea was basically that, for my entire life, everyone I talk to views it as a quote mistake. It's the idea that, we would go and invade this country, and, savagely murder, a million people for oil or for other reasons, just having nothing to do with democracy promotion. Like, it's just a foreign idea to many people, and that they can't accept. So the intentions are always correct with all of our foreign policy. And I think there's a sort of disbelief that the United States could have accepted or condoned what Epstein was doing, even though there's plenty of evidence that they did. This allegation that Epstein actually worked for Israeli intelligence. This is something that most people, I would say, probably believe at this point. Thomas Massey just did a poll on his Twitter. Something like 90% of respondents, of the 100,000 people that responded, said, yeah, absolutely. And that's an idea that would also help explain why we've learned pretty much nothing about Epstein and why everything's been covered up. But again, as I said, there's people who dismiss that claim. They can't believe it. They'll say that the US government would never condone that sort of behavior, human trafficking, the abuse of children, that they'd never allow it. But, we did allow that sort of behavior, for instance, in Afghanistan for 2 decades. It was a common practice, as you know, in parts of Afghanistan for men to keep young boys as slaves and sexually abuse them. And so you had these US soldiers in Afghanistan who would, walk past young boys, who are often wearing women's clothing, by the way, just holding hands with strange older men. And everyone became aware of that practice, and nobody really cared. The Pentagon actually knew about it. And we sent money to military units that practiced that form of child sex slavery anyway, because they were on our side. Now, the Taliban outlawed that practice, but we wanted to replace the Taliban with our own, democratic government. So we looked the other way and allowed it to continue. And, some U.S. contractors even participated in that sexual abuse, as WikiLeaks revealed. So before we get into the facts of whether or not Epstein was this intelligence asset and allowed to operate for these political reasons, can you just explain why it's naive for people to believe that the U.S. government is beyond allowing and facilitating that kind of criminal behavior?
Well, it goes, but it's such it's such a deep subject in terms of the criminality of the regime and how the U.S. accommodates criminality and essentially makes it part of its system of governance, that it's difficult to know where to begin with. But the national crime syndicate that emerged in the 20th century was, I would say that it was ultimately dominated by Meyer Lansky, who was a Mossad asset. And the key flow of finances that they benefited from was the international drug traffic. I mean, the domestic and international drug traffic. So you have places like Marseille, France, and Southeast Asia producing, and Mexico, as another hub of heroin, and producing all of these profits from drugs. And after Prohibition was ended, drugs became the new thing that the mob was, very, that they were going to benefit from, they're going to profit from. And they took over gambling on a nationwide scale. They did this especially with the takeover of the National Wire Service, and they partner with the government around the same time. So Meyer Lansky was given the Medal of Freedom by Harry Truman in 1945. And he was bailed out of, or he was, the Office of Naval Intelligence partnered with him to try to make sure that the docks were free of sabotage and so on. And later they helped with the invasion of Sicily. So, there's a obviously important organized crime presence in Sicily. And Meyer Lansky had them bail his friend Lucky Luciano out of jail, and they were back in business. And around the same time, Meyer Lansky, now that he's partnering with the government and he's been given the Medal of Freedom from Harry Truman, He sets up a drug connection in Mexico with a guy named Harold Meltzer. And in order to launder the money from that, he creates Las Vegas. And Las Vegas becomes this huge money laundering capital for Lansky. I mean, it's like these casinos, like the Sands Casino now owned by Adelson. That was a Lansky enterprise. And they partner with the Teamsters, who are corrupted, and their pension fund is controlled by the mob. And this is the result of a murder in 1939. And one of the people, witnesses to the murder, present in the room during this murder, that allows for a more corrupt individual to take over a local union and then eventually moves control of the Teamsters pension fund into mob hands, right? And the person that was present at that murder was Jack Ruby. And he was arrested and questioned about this, and probably an informant for this, because he later became an informant for the FBI and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics as well. Now, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics has a guy named George Hunter White, who was the person who managed Operation Underworld when they were the Naval Intelligence was partnered, and the OSS was partnered with Lansky and Luciano. So this guy, George Hunter White, goes on to be one of the main people in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and he also does work for CIA MK Ultra programs. So he's dosing people with acid and watching how they respond, and probably getting blackmail on people in these sorts of strange ways, and all of these things associated with the CIA's dark side. But their partnership with the drug running entities and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics is a big deal. And the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Harry Anslinger, they have a modus vivendi with Lansky. So in all the years that they're going after, the U.S. is supposedly going after the mob, the three people that they never wiretap are Meyer Lansky, Santo Trafficante, and Carlos Marcello. And they're the three top people involved in the drug trade in the United States, in the syndicate. Lansky eventually retires as the top person, I believe, in 1970, and Trafficante takes that role. But Trafficante and his father were close associates with Lansky. And additionally, in 1946, there's a murder of a guy named James Reagan, and he was the other wire service competitor, or he was the person who controlled the wire service, and they wanted it back in the hands of the Annenberg family. The older Annenberg, Moses Annenberg, was a close associate of Lansky. He eventually went to jail, but his son it eventually takes over the wire service after the James Reagan murder. And he was murdered by people who were associated with this person named Paul Roland Jones, who also was very close to Jack Ruby. So Jack Ruby is this key figure involved in the takeover of organized crime nationally, the history of it. And he is essentially like a syndicate lieutenant, and he is the person in Dallas. So he controls the fix with the authorities and how to get the drugs in, through Dallas and everything else. And this is kind of institutionalized nationwide. So the takeover of the wire service is a part of that, because once you control the national wire service with the gambling in every city, and you've got cops taking bribes for that, you've essentially got them on the hook for whatever organized crime wants. You get in there, you get them corrupted with taking bribes for something. It's just a little gambling, then you're able to corrupt the whole political system of the place. And they repeat that throughout the country, and the U.S. always had this sort of mobbed up part to it, and it was more controlled than people understood. Lansky at one point said the mob is bigger than U.S. Steel. So it's a huge part of the economy, and it's intertwined with the national security state at the end of World War II. And this is, I think, one of the national secrets that the U.S. has had, and it's metastasized, and is a way to help understand why we've become so corrupt, because there's just criminality in the way that this whole regime functions. And Lansky, a part of Lansky's power in Washington was sexual blackmail. Peter Dale Scott writes about this in Deep Politics and the Death of JFK, which is published by the University of California, and it's very meticulous. And the CIA eventually dabbles in these areas as well. And there's other incidents like this, like the Franklin scandal in the late 80s and early 90s broke, and it got connected to even people close to the White House. A guy named Craig Spence was written up in the Washington Times. And so it seems like after that era, there's a little bit of a power struggle over the deep state in the early 90s. And I think it kind of goes back to being controlled more squarely by Zionist aligned people. Like when people talk about BCCI, you've heard of BCCI as this criminal bank that the CIA used in the 80s. It gets found in the
For
late
Iran
70s.
Contra. That was the bank
Yeah,
that
it's
the Adnan Khashoggi used in the Iran Contra affair.
right. And that's just one of the things that they were involved in. They were just this massive money laundering, intelligence operations financing entity. So they worked with the mob and the CIA and both, and it's hard to tell where one begins and where the other ends. But the interesting thing about it is it gets shut down in the early 90s, and the person behind that is a New York attorney for the government, like I guess a Justice Department official or official for the state of New York, maybe an attorney general for the state of New York, something like that is his position. And it's Morgenthau, a guy named Morgenthau, whose father is either him or his father, but I think it was his father, was one of the main people in the U.S. who was working with the Israelis to procure funding and financing and organizing for the acquisition of the bomb, the nuclear bomb. So it's a guy who's a super ardent Zionist, and he goes after BCCI. And I believe what's happening there was that they were going to essentially Mossad was going to blackmail the U.S. about all of the criminal things the U.S. is involved with. So you wonder about some of these exposés of, in Iran-Contra, for example, you hear stories about them trafficking drugs. And why is Congress even going after Iran-Contra? And I think it has to do with the conflict between organized crime factions, those that are more American, and then those that are more loyal to Israel. And I think that the Israel side kind of won.
The reason that people believe that Epstein was an Israeli intelligence asset is because there's all sorts of evidence for it. Firstly, what Maria Farmer reported to the FBI and the New York Police Department in the 1990s after she was locked up and abused at Les Wexner's Ohio compound. And Wexner, of course, was a major Israel lobbyist. He founded the MAGA group in the 1990s, which coordinated with the Israeli government to influence U.S. foreign policy. So right off the bat, you have a major Zionist billionaire who have people calling the FBI and the NYPD, reporting them for kidnapping and sexual abuse. So with only that information, it could just be a couple of Zionist billionaires who were, abusing these women, no one else involved, no intelligence connections. But, in 2007, when Alex Acosta was prosecuting Jeffrey Epstein, he was told that, quote, Epstein belonged to intelligence. He was told to leave it alone. And as a result, Epstein got this sweetheart deal. Many of the charges against him were dropped in a case where you had interviews with dozens of underage rape victims. And then finally, Epstein's longtime girlfriend and partner in crime, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, was famously an Israeli spy. Can you just discuss what you think is the best evidence that Epstein was working in some capacity on behalf of the Israeli government?
The Ghislaine Maxwell angle is very obvious because her father was Robert Maxwell and he died under very mysterious circumstances, I believe in 1991, which was a very tumultuous year in terms of this whole relationship and conflict between I would say an Americanized CIA and then more neoconservative Zionist aligned aspects of the U.S. oligarchy. And so he dies seems to have been murdered. That seems to be the consensus of most people who look at the case. And the boat was called the Ghislaine. So for what that's worth. And so that's a very clear link to Israeli intelligence that her father was a notorious Mossad asset. And the fact that Epstein's original patron was Wexner, who you mentioned, and he is Zionist oligarch fellow, and he's part of that mega group that was written about as a network of people, influential Americans, and I guess Canadians too, maybe,
The
who are
Bronfmans,
extremely
sure.
pro-Israel. And they were in contact with Israeli intelligence, apparently. And the White House was trying to figure out what it was. And among the people in that list of, it was Steven Spielberg is maybe the weirdest one to most people, but there's also Wexner, as I said, and somebody from the Bronfman family, which is the one that owns Seagram's, and they were Lansky's partners in Prohibition, and they made all that money bootlegging to the U.S. So that is, I mean, you'd have to say that's kind of, Jewish mafia, which is something we're not conditioned to think of in the U.S. We're told it's an Italian thing. And the funny thing is that that sort of myth is kind of propagated by Hollywood Zionists, pretty much. If you look back at it, it was Sidney Korshak was a mob lawyer, very close to people in Hollywood, and he was instrumental in getting The Godfather made. And The Godfather's kind of like propaganda. If you see The Godfather too, there's like a Meyer Lansky type figure, I think like Hyman Rothman or something like that, right? And he's trying to flee to Israel to be safe, but instead he gets killed in the airport. But in real life, Meyer Lansky did go to Israel, and he stayed there until Nixon was so embroiled in Watergate that it seems to have changed the politics, and then it was safe to come back to the U.S. And it was the people like Johnny Rosselli and Sam Giancana and Jimmy Hoffa, these are the ones who get killed, when everything goes down in the mid 70s. So it's weird that Hollywood had that, wanted to have that myth. It was just not how it played out at all. Additionally, in that mega group in the 90s of, super Mossad oligarchs, Mossad connected oligarchs, you had someone from the Crown family. And that's a family that tracks back to the murder to take over the wire service. And the patriarch of that family, Klinsky or Henry Crown or Henry Klinsky, I think, or Krinsky was his original name, from, Eastern Europe. And it was a very mobbed up family. They were involved in a scandal involving a procurement deal in the early 60s. Could have taken down Lyndon Johnson. General Dynamics was the company, and it was essentially mobbed up with the Chicago outfit and Henry Crown's money that he'd made. So it's the connections between the organized crime and the super Zionists in the U.S. is really huge. Lansky was one of the main people. Lansky and Jimmy Hoffa were both deeply involved in shipping the arms to Israel in 1948.